Welcome to episode 97 of School Librarians United. I'm your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 14th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, by my interview guests, and by listeners who contact the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school district. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to Blake in Tennessee and Megan in Texas. Megan was very kind to email me, and I asked if I could share her message. Megan wrote, Amy, I found your podcast this summer, and I am loving it. I am currently finishing up my Librarian certification, and I found your episodes extremely helpful when dreaming about my future as a librarian. Your guests are delightful and full of great ideas and encouragement. Thank you, Megan. What a wonderful reminder that aspiring school librarians are tuning in to the episodes. And Megan's absolutely right. The guests featured on each episode are inspiring, and their experience and their perspectives are incredibly valuable. So consider this an invitation to listeners who would like to share their resources and help support school librarians in our listening community. This podcast is in Season 3. Entirely because of the willingness of school librarians to gather their thoughts on a particular aspect of our jobs and to let me know you're interested. Once we arrive at an episode topic, we generate an outline of questions using a shared Google Doc. I ask you to offer links to resources our listeners can access in the show notes. We use Skype and earbuds, and we need about an hour of your time. And that's all there is to it. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback, questions, and episode suggestions either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now for today's episode, Stuff They Didn't Teach You in Library School, and my interview with Lori Davis. I'm so excited to be sharing this conversation with you today. Lori Davis has graciously accepted an invitation to join the podcast. And I'll be honest, I extended this invitation a year ago, and I have no idea what happened to my organization or lack thereof. But in October of 2019, clearly, I misplaced my contact page for Lori Davis. We wrote the outline. It was a great outline. I was super excited. And then a year went by, and I found it. And I am really embarrassed. Lori Davis, you are a gracious guest. Thank you very much for coming to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, now, remind me, because I've just told everybody we were supposed to do this last year. The inspiration for this episode came from a Facebook post, didn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Can you remind me, because I know, I think we were just talking about what it came up that we just had not learned how to do certain things in library school.
Yes.
And I remember saying, yeah, you want to talk about it on a podcast? And you're like, okay.
Yeah, because I'm still in that, honeymoon phase of a new career. And I'm, searching for any sort of help, kind of like I need any kind of lifesaver I can get. And I was like, yeah, okay. Well, if it'll help someone else.
And I've stopped counting, but Facebook is full of helpful groups. Facebook is full of a lot of things, but when it comes to being a school librarian, I belong to a lot of Facebook groups. I get great ideas for episodes. I meet lovely people like you. And, it has been, and as it relates to today's topic, stuff they didn't teach you in library school, this is how we fill some of those gaps in our education. All right. Terrific. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey to becoming a school librarian, because while, we're going to have a great conversation, the difference between you and me is about 12 years in the field of school librarianship. And I'm guessing I'm probably twice your age. So, so Lori, tell us, how did you come to be the school librarian that you are today?
Well, if I were to give you a visual, give a 2-year-old a crayon and a white piece of paper, and that scribble would be my journey. Some people say it's a straight line or it's up and down, and mine was definitely not like that at all.
Were you in the right place at the right time?
Yes, absolutely. I always knew that I wanted to get a master's degree. Education is always so huge for everyone in my family. It was never if you go to school, it was always when. And I am the definition of a nerd. I love learning and reading, and knowledge is, I just enjoy all that. So I knew I wanted to get a master's, but I had no clue what I was going to get it in. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll do archival work, or maybe I'll do another English degree. And then one day in 2017 in April, I'm driving down the road and I just had this clear thought, you're going to be a librarian. And I remember going, okay, I'm going to be a librarian. And so the deadline was May the 8th. And this was mid-April. And so I just sent out, please, will you write a letter for me? I know it's last minute. And I sound like the high school kids that ask for those recommendation letters, but it would mean the world to me. And then I started in September.
Wow. I think listeners right now are nodding their heads and saying, yep, I remember. I won't go so far as to say it was the call. You got the call to become a librarian, but we do have that sort of proverbial light bulb moment where you realize, I know exactly what I want to do. And it is that fresh a memory that I had. And for me, I was a high school social studies teacher, and the state of Michigan requires that we continue getting credits. And the best way to secure our go from a provisional teaching certificate to a professional teaching certificate is to take those university courses, which of course are expensive, but you get those pay raises. And I remember looking around and I tried to figure out who in the building was the happiest person, the person who was not complaining every day, the person who loved their job, the person who always had a smile on their face. And for me, it was the school librarian, and she was my hero. I relied on her she was my life preserver in this job that I had, which was ridiculous. High school teacher, I had 7 preps. I had 4 preps my first semester, and then 3 different preps my second semester. And everyone around me was twice my age, and really didn't care that I had the worst schedule on the hall, because they had all paid their dues. They weren't going to teach all those electives, and Carla, the librarian, rescued me. So,
thank you, Carla.
Yes. Now I'm curious, Lori, tell me about your library school experience. And friends, we're not going to use any names because I don't want anybody's feelings to be hurt. I don't want any professional organizations to feel targeted. But the truth of the matter is that there are so many things that school librarians need going into that first library. And school libraries around the country do a rock star job of getting us prepared. I just think there are some topics which don't make the syllabus. So, Lori, tell us a little bit about being in library school.
Okay. And I will say, first of all, really grateful for my overall experience. Met some incredible people, had some incredible opportunities, but anyone who's listening, if they were a teacher, they know it's the exact same thing. When you get theory, you don't necessarily get those practical skills in school. And so you go into the field and you're like, all right, I'm ready. I'm going to change the world. And then you're like, how do you cover a book? I never learned. I've just been using YouTube and Facebook groups. I'm like, okay, here I am, the one with the degree, the one with the quote unquote knowledge. I don't know how to use a freaking Capco cover. I don't even know what a Capco cover is. And so those are some of the things that I was like, this is great, but, and I will say this, kind of a quick caveat. I did not go to library school thinking I wanted to be a school librarian. I was pretty disillusioned with education in general. And I was like, I can't be in a school setting. I'm burnt out. And I can't even imagine what it's like to be a teacher right now. Oh, my heart goes out to everyone in a classroom because, wow. But yeah, I didn't want to be a teacher. And so I'm thinking, like, do I really need to memorize all of these mark record numbers? Like, is this, can I just look it up in a book? Which is terrible. For anyone listening who's probably like, oh my gosh, that is of the utmost importance.
No, this is a judgment-free zone. Judgment-free zone. I think that listeners know I have admitted to many things, and you know what? I'm just going to have to own it. And at this point, this is your journey, and that's okay. and you're my guest, and I'm asking these intrusive questions. So,
no.
But let me ask you, because I'm old enough that most of my program was done face to face. Most of my program was face to face, and there might have been, like, out of a 13-week course, 3 of those classes might have been done on a say, I think we used Blackboard. We used some sort of platform online, which we could do instead of going onto campus. But, and I loved going on campus because at the time my children were I had 3 under the age of 6. And so I loved going to school because that was my little brain break. It was my little reminder that I still had brain cells connected and I could feel human again. But, I liked being on campus, but nobody put damaged books in front of me and said, hey, great day to be in class. We're going to be repairing these books today. It's like,
yes.
No, it was very theoretical. There was a great deal of emphasis on theory. And so it's not so much that my experience was face to face and yours. Did you take classes on campus or did you learn remotely?
No, it was 100% online.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, you, in terms of like hands-on, getting your hands into working with, in this case, damaged books, that's one of those things that you're going to sort of learn as you start that first year in your library. So I'm curious, one of the things that really stuck out to me, and I wrote it in my notes a year ago, was that you describe yourself as the Lone Ranger. And I knew when you did that you had clearly been feeling these feelings and they were very strong. You have self-identified as the Lone Ranger. Would you please explain to the audience, why that was something that was important when you said that on Facebook?
Yes. So when I decided in that fateful day in the car in April, I immediately reached out to a good friend of mine who is a middle school librarian in the Houston area. And I said, this is what I think I want to do. I'm looking at this school. I know it's where you went. Do you have any advice or whatnot? So she gave me lots of great advice. But the thing that stuck out to me is that she said being a librarian is like being on an island alone. She said, because you don't have like subject level teachers, you don't have grade level teachers. And she said, no one really gets what you do because there are so many of those behind the scene moments. And I remember even the summer before I officially began, I was at a workshop and the presenter said, does anybody in your school know what you do? And every single person said, nope. Because you're it. And I think it's even sometimes I feel like it's more difficult, and sometimes I'm like, I think I've got a pretty sweet spot. But I'm a district librarian in a pretty remote area in East Texas, and I am the only librarian for 4 libraries. And I have a full-time aide on each campus that's there for organizing and reshelving and checking in and out books. But I mean, they didn't know what a bone folder was. And to me, it's like one of the best tools I have in my library.
Yes. And by the way, if you don't have a bone folder, I've also found that the backside, if we're talking about the same thing, the backside of a pair of scissors will also work just as well. So friends, if you can't find your trusty bone folder, and you may have one and not know that's what it's called, but I know because I looked it up in Follett. But you can use the backside of a pair of dollar store scissors and making sure that it's plastic, of course, and it'll work just as well. I love that you mentioned a couple things. District librarians, friends. I'm going to spoil the surprise, but on the horizon somewhere, I have a great interview lined up with a district librarian who is going to shed some knowledge on how one is a district librarian, covering buildings, working with people, and it just. The challenges, that is in and of itself its own episode. I love that you mentioned that you went to workshops, because I think that before the pandemic, that was a great way for school librarians and any professional to augment and supplement that foundational education that you got in library school with knowledge now that you have some sort of framework. And when you go to library school, all too often you don't have that scaffolding. You don't have that foundational knowledge so that people can teach you stuff. But if you've never actually worked in a library, some of this is like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
Well, and the whole idea of seeking out others who do what you do, that oftentimes, pre-pandemic, that was going to happen in the form of a conference, in the form of, your meetings at your state level and going to workshops. And for better or for worse, all of that's now happening online. Lori, I'm really curious because in talking about this with you, you mentioned before we pressed record on this episode that the librarian that you followed, the previous librarian, did leave you a notebook with a few helpful things that you should know. It's not a manual. It's certainly not comprehensive, but how did you, you're very lucky. Some of us get to meet the person we replace. Some of us walk into a space that hasn't seen a librarian for years. And so how did you go from there? You have this manual that's been given to you, but how else did you, get through that first year when you walked into that new library of yours?
Well, I will say one of the things in the manual that I really loved that the previous librarian wrote. So there was it was great. There was a cover page, and she said, congrats on your new job. And she said, you will see things in the library that you probably won't understand. And you're like, why did they do it that way? And she said, just know that every librarian before you was taught differently and has different feelings and has different, what's the word she used? Anyway, basically different ways of going about things. And I thought, okay, I'm going to remember that, because there are some things that I look at and I'm like, why? Who would label a book like this? Like, those Who Is or Who Was, that series?
Of course.
I don't know who it was, and God love them. They did not do the spine labels by author. They did it by the person the book was about. So if it was Who Was Albert Einstein, but it was written by Smith, you're going to see EIN on the spine label and not Smith.
Well, and isn't it fair to say that, you walk into other people's libraries And you appreciate that there was a library is full of a lot of cumulative, intentional decision making. Everything in a library has on some level been thought out, and why it is where it is, and why it looks the way it does, and why these books were purchased. And, I've sometimes referred to our collections as sort of time capsules, because they embody the curricular, sort of demands and the changing, curriculum that our students have been exposed to. So whoever was the librarian in the 1990s is going to have a considerably different sort of mandate by the curriculum standards and the different teachers who are coming through, saying, okay, in the 2000s, all of a sudden the books, we had to shift gears and we're not doing explorers anymore. And now we're doing, endangered animals. I know when my kids were little, everybody did endangered animals. I teach in the same district. We do not do anything about endangered animals specifically curriculum wise. So you look at these, you look at what the person before you did, and it's hard not to be a little judgy.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, I need to remember this line that the previous librarian said. And that has been really helpful. And she even admitted some really great things. She's like, you know what? I excelled in this area, but I really dropped the ball in this area. So that might be somewhere you'd like to focus. And I was like, okay, this is good. And then there were things about like, here's our district policy, but there was no collection development policy. And so I ended up writing one of those with the help of some amazing people.
I was going to say, your first year, you wrote a collection development policy.
Yes.
All right.
Now, I don't know how good it is, but that's actually one of the things that we had to do in school.
Yeah. All right. Well, Lone Ranger and Fearless. All right.
Or stupid. I don't know.
I think some of that overlaps. I think you have to have courage and stupidity. I'm sure that there is some overlap there. And I think that clearly sometimes we just have to press forward because in your case, you are the Lone Ranger and you don't have a team of other school librarians who do what you do. Let me ask you, because I'm curious and the listeners will want to know, can you give us an idea of your district and, what you oversee in terms of how many schools you said you mentioned 4 schools. Can you give us an idea of the breakdown of grade levels and, geographically, are you in a large area? So can you tell us a little bit about your district?
Yes. And I wanted to say one thing real quick about that collection development policy. The very first thing I learned as a teacher was CYA. And again, the district I work in is pretty conservative, and so I thought this collection development policy is got to be CYA. So that was probably my motivation, really, more than anything else.
Got it. And friends, for some of our international listeners, because I do have some listeners outside of the United States, CYA is a very handy euphemism for cover your, and then it's your posterior. So a CYA policy is simply one that is making sure that you cover all your bases when it comes to making sure you will not find yourself in a regrettable situation in the future. And it requires some planning. Yes, when one writes a collection development policy in a very conservative community, one has to exercise a certain amount of diplomacy in how things are addressed. And losing your job is not one of the things we're going to do. So we got to make sure that we CYA. So tell us a little bit about your district.
All right. So there are 4 campuses. The elementary campus is pre-K to 3, and the intermediate campus is 4 and 5. The junior high campus is 6 through 8, and high school is 9 through 12. And it's actually all pretty walkable unless I have a box of books I'm delivering, and then I have, a cart, or on super hot days, I'll just drive.
can I just say, and you mentioned the 4 to 5. Sometimes I've heard that described as an academy. I would love to interview somebody who teaches a 4-5 academy, a group that is really just and it's pre-middle school. I mean, that's the key thing here, is that you are differentiating your littles and your lower elementary, and then you've got this like upper elementary, and it really would be, I can't fathom, although I'm just so, it would be so cool to develop that collection, because it's so incredibly targeted with those 4th and 5th grade readers. So. Oh
yeah. They love, the usuals though, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Tales or Dork Diaries or whatever. They can't get enough graphic novels. And this year they're like, we want the scary. A little girl came in last week. What is the scariest book you have? And I'm a total pansy, so I don't read scary stories. And I was like, yeah, honey, I don't know. If it's not R.L. Stein, like, here's one called The Jumbies.
In Michigan, we have a local author, and his name is Jonathan Rand. And Jonathan Rand did the American Chillers. So there are American Chillers, and then because he's Michigan, we have Michigan Chillers, and those are all upper elementary and fairly popular here in the state of Michigan. So I'm curious, can you give us this idea of what is happening in your space right now in terms of the pandemic? I will tell listeners, when we recorded this, we start hybrid on Monday. So we started distance learning on the 8th of September, and then starting on the the 12th of October, we're going hybrid. We're pivoting. And another word I'm very tired of hearing. So what does teaching in a pandemic look like in your neighborhood?
Like everyone, it's been a bit of a whirlwind. Last year I tried to teach because I wanted students to know who the librarian was. And they really didn't know who she was. When I worked at the same district as a high school English teacher, I didn't know that we had a librarian. And I reached out to her about some databases, and she was like, oh yeah, no, we don't have any of those. And I was like, okay, thanks. So that's the only really interaction I had. And so I wanted the kids to know who I was, not to to put myself on a pedestal or anything like that. But I never had a positive experience with a librarian at school as a child, or even in college. And so I'm like, the librarian should be this happy person, should be Carla, and so I wanted to do that. And so I taught. This year, it is not like that at all. The aides are doing the teaching. I'm creating the lessons. We are quarantining the books. And so the kids are really upset because they can see the quarantine books like over in this dark corner. And they're like, but I survived. And I'm like, 3 days, baby, 3 days, you can have it. Masks and hand sanitizing. But it's really interesting because a lot of school districts around me they're kind of over the distance learning, and they've actually stopped it completely and have sent out newsletters saying, we will no longer be doing distance learning. You are welcome to transfer to another school district or do homeschool or whatever it is. Our teachers are overwhelmed. They're overworked, underpaid. It's a pretty toxic environment. And in the state of Texas, every child is supposed to have, free education, but it does not say what the education has to look like. So,
wow. Well, and I think that if there's one great equalizer is that the pandemic has turned veteran school librarians like myself, it really has put us all somewhat on an equal footing. And this has been, for me, incredibly unsettling because I can't rely on the 13 years that got me here as a school librarian. And I think it is humbling in that respect because I am now remembering exactly what it felt like to be clueless. And so let's bring it back to this idea of what you didn't learn in library school, because while this isn't your first year on the job, am I right? It's your second year?
Well, people ask me how my first year went, and I'm like, well, guys, it ended in March. So
you've not had a full year. Oh my goodness.
I'm not.
The phrase trial by fire comes to mind because as a newbie, as a rookie librarian. So what has surprised you about being a new librarian?
I guess everything is not an acceptable answer. Managing people. I was not fully prepared for that. Let me tell you one thing my school did really well, and they pushed and pushed and pushed, advocate for your library, advocate for yourself. And so I had never really been a fan of Twitter before, or never really used it. I'm not a big social media. That's just not really my thing. I mean, I get recipes from Pinterest, and that's about it, So advocating, I was like, all right, I'm getting on Twitter, and thank God I did, because I was able to find you and Future Ready Librarians and so many people who filled those gaps for me. But yeah, going back to the I don't know how to repair books. I'm still YouTubing it. And I'm like, there are gobs of tape in this one cabinet in my office. And I'm like, I don't even know what half this stuff is. And so I'm trying to learn those sorts of things. But then again, back to that managing people. I'm so grateful for Brene Brown, Dare to Lead. I use that to get my aides on board and build that trust and relationships with them. And also, no one at all told me about like book vendors or who's good to buy from, who has this policy or any of these sorts of things. That would have been so helpful, because pre-librarian school, I was like, yeah, Scholastic, woo, And then now I'm like, oh my gosh, there's, Follett, and then you have Dimco, and you've got Mackin, and Ingram, and Lookout Books, and yeah, there's a plethora.
As a district librarian, the scope of your responsibilities go beyond it encompasses your entire district. So whereas I make decisions for individual libraries, you're making a decision that affects everyone in your district. So yeah. I think that it's rather daunting, to say the least. Lori, can you give us an idea? What would you suggest to library schools that they could do better to prepare their librarians in training for that first library job?
Oh man, yeah. One thing that would be incredibly helpful, because I'm dealing with it currently, is library management systems. Please talk about that. It feels like everyone in the state of Texas uses Destiny. And because this is the judgment-free zone, I'm just going to say I'm not a fan. And maybe that's because it's like I was thrown to the wolves. I told you I had a manual, but I did not have a Destiny manual. And I'm just like, what is this? How do I do it? Why is this not? So yeah, anything about a library management system would be so incredibly helpful. Yeah, talking about vendors, like where do you buy library things? Also, what library things are useful? And I know there's not going to be like this definitive list, but like I said, I have a lot of tape in my office. I still don't know what half of it's used for. And so practical things, those practical skills, repairing and processing books. Talk about barcodes. I know that sounds ridiculous, but again, I'm in the midst of that little battle.
Well, and can I just say, for me, I remember feeling so capable. I remember Walter, I graduated from library school. I had been a high school teacher for about 10 years, and I was walking into what was going to be my very first library job. And I think I found it so disorienting because I was convinced I was well prepared. I had a master's degree. I had 10 years of teaching experience. This is doable. And yet you don't know what you don't know until you don't know it. Mm-hmm. And it's so, like, I know as dumb as that sounds, like, until you realize there are gaps in your education or experience, like, that kind of stuff hits you like a rock. You're like, wait, I have no idea how to do that. Fill in the blank. Yeah. I have no idea how to blank, fill in the blank. So, you mentioned the things like you did learn a lot about the importance of advocacy. I didn't realize that we would have a certain expectation that we would have to raise our own money. Mm. And I just sort of assumed everybody walked in and their libraries had these great budgets.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say there's never enough money. It doesn't matter what that magic number is. You can always create other needs, and other needs come up, and then you realize there are these priorities in this space, things that your library so desperately needs. And yet those kinds of transformations sometimes take not only money, but time.
Yes.
So I want to take a break. I have been very forthcoming. Most listeners have heard at some point or another in my episodes, I graduated from Wayne State University, School of Library and Information Science. And now it is actually called the Wayne State University's School of Information Sciences. And since I graduated, the name has changed and the program has changed. But I will say I thought, and I feel, and I still feel that the preparation I was given was really first class. And some of the lessons that really stuck with me were the advocacy piece, because I remember it was sort of drummed into us by instructors who were in the trenches, as it were. These were librarians who were not necessarily faculty; they were adjunct faculty. They were They worked. They were in the trenches. They were school librarians by day, superheroes by night. They taught my classes on the weekends, and really hammered home the idea that we could lose our jobs at any time. And I know that that's more of a state of Michigan predicament. I think that is more specific to our current, I say current, this was 20 years ago. The fact is that if you didn't work your tail off, somebody might decide you're not necessary. So,
oh yeah. I felt that in this pandemic. I just knew I was going to lose my job. I was waiting for the superintendent to call me to tell me, you know what, we're all online. We don't need you.
Well, and I will say, by the time this episode airs, you will have all heard the episode that I'm posting tomorrow about virtual burnout. And a lot of that was attributed to the stress of the unknown, not knowing what the fall would look like, not knowing our job security, and and I completely, and I can relate to that as well. A couple things I remember my instructors at Wayne State were really emphasized the importance of us being able to be incredibly flexible. That our job was going to take on many different shapes, that what would be expected of us as librarians could mean overseeing, like you, a district, like me, multiple buildings, a fixed schedule versus a flexible schedule, and that you would have to be to everybody everything. That it's entirely possible that somebody doesn't care that you come to with all this training and expertise, but if you know how to fix the copier, now all of a sudden you've become essential. And if you know how to feed the laminate into the laminating machine correctly, you're now essential. The fact that you went to library school really doesn't have anything to do with it.
Right. Yep. Thankfully, the laminating machine is not in a library on all 4 campuses. So I'm really grateful for that.
Well, and I do remember very well, and you mentioned this already about MARC records, but learning cataloging. And for us, it was learning the Dewey Decimal System and how the library is organized. And it was almost like they gave 2 lessons, because on the one hand, they talked about the importance of cataloging and why this was critical and why, you had to have this precision when it came to what was on your shelves and where it was located. And yet they also made it clear that if there was a better way to organize your collection so students would access it and more easily find what they were looking for, that's okay too.
Yes. I wish I would have received more of the latter. Because I'll be honest, I actually enjoyed my cataloging class. I loved my professor. And what's funny is I was actually taking classes in conservation and preservation in Italy at the same time I was online doing cataloging. And I love the organization, and it's easy to find, and et cetera, et cetera. But in the state of Texas, I didn't know curriculum because I had always taught high school English. So 9th through 12th, in my 10 years of being in a classroom, that's all I knew. And then when I learned that in Texas, kids don't learn what decimals are until 4th grade, I was like, why are we putting decimals on spine labels in the elementary? And then I attended this really great webinar called Ditching Dewey. And that has just opened up so many possibilities that I'm really excited about.
Well, and I think that it's, again, thankfully you found a webinar. Thankfully we find these great, oftentimes we hear about them on social media, but it's a great way to supplement what we've learned and extend that. And now that you have a foundation and you work in a library, you can now take what you've learned in library school and apply it in a way that really helps you in your current situation. I also remember another lesson was taught to me in library school was really our jobs is one of service, that our jobs is to support others, whether it is supporting my students, it's supporting my teachers, it's supporting my building, it's supporting my administration at the district level. My job is in many ways making other people's jobs easier, better. Yeah. I'm sort of like if you have a picture and you can press that enhance button, and it just enhances the picture. All right. So I sort of feel like I can come to a situation like somebody doing they're teaching their lessons and I can help you enhance it.
Yeah, exactly.
Another lesson, and I remember the day I was taught this, and I mentioned this in my very early episode called Self-Censorship, and that was no book is worth my job, and that I serve no purpose if I get fired over a book. I will be no good to anybody. And the message there was, pick your battles. And you mentioned that you live and work in a very conservative area, that you recognize that you may be called upon to in some cases defend, and in some places be expected to explain why certain titles have or have not been chosen to be in the collections that you support.
Yes, I wish that I would have had more of that lesson too, because I felt like the push for me was, everyone gets a chance. I mean, to read whatever they want, to search whatever they want, and you provide that. And I wasn't really taught anything of, a book is not worth your job, because I remember I wish I could remember who said the quote, but it said, every great library will have something to offend everyone. Yeah, I mean, that's probably, everyone knows that in the library world. And they could probably tell you, they could probably cite the evidence, and here I am struggling. No,
I can show you which books they are on the shelf right now, too.
Yeah, exactly.
We just had Banned Book Week. And I'll tell you what, tell me that I'm not supposed to have this book in my library, and all of a sudden now I want this book in my library in the worst way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's hard because I'm of a mind that, okay, no book is going to turn you into something that you're not. Okay, no book is going to do that. But I think true intelligence and true wisdom is being able to read that book and say, I can now have empathy for others, because that's the point. I mean, that's the beauty and the power of words. But reading Communist Manifesto isn't going to make me a communist. You know, I don't believe reading a book about a serial killer is not going to make me a serial killer. And I'm sure anyone listening can get where I'm going with this probably, but I want to have the books that are going to make kids think and are going to allow them to see difficult situations in a very safe space.
Absolutely. I think that I couldn't put it better myself. One more aspect which I feel I have been largely filling in gaps, and that is when it comes to technology. Because I think that because technology is constantly improving and evolving, I don't blame anybody. I don't think my library school could have done a better job, because truth be told, you know, the technology when I started my degree in 2007 is, you know, where we are now could not have ever been, you know, imagined, you know, 14 years ago. And so when it comes to technology, I think that that's one of those areas where we are expected as professionals to continue that education. We are expected to do some training on our own. And oftentimes, and this is something that was a very big difference from being a school librarian and being a classroom teacher, is oftentimes I was training myself how to do something when it comes to technology, not because I needed it necessarily, because I knew that in the next week or two, I was going to be bombarded with questions about how to do something from my classroom teachers. And that, again, is something that I don't think I necessarily could have anticipated in library school, that you're going to be learning things not because they're going to help you do your job better as a librarian, but because you're going to have to help others do their jobs better.
Yeah.
Wow.
And see, I was literally 10 years behind you, 2017 to 2019. And I had a school librarian professor, and she was phenomenal at, like, you have to be ahead of the technology. If 10.0 is out right now, you better know 10.1. And she even had us do coding, which I had very little experience with. And so we actually had to do a lesson with Scratch and how to do that. And I was really grateful. I mean, there was a lot of cussing in my house. Thankfully, I lived alone, and my mother did not hear me. But there was Dr. Pepper and cussing trying to get this coding lesson finished. But yeah, she was great. It was always, technology is not going to take your job. But you need to be, you know, besides the technology director, you need to really be that next big person in understanding and using and being able to teach technology to others.
Absolutely. So. I do want to mention, because my practicum, this was something that I was thinking about as well when it comes to preparing pre-service librarians. My practicum involved something far different from a student teaching experience. In the state of Michigan, if you're going to be a school librarian, you have to first be a teacher with a valid teaching certificate, which means you've done that semester of student teaching. Mm-hmm. It could have been a decade ago, or some of us even long before that. But our practicums as school librarians were very different. For me, I was required 40 clock hours. So in effect, I mean, if you worked full time with other school librarians, you could knock that out in fairly short order. What was your practicum like? And do you think I guess my question is, what needs to be done differently with the practicum to make it to serve our our pre-service librarians better.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I laughed not because of the question, because you had 40 hours and I had to have 160. So.
Okay, you can laugh at me.
No. I just was like, I remember when I read that number and I thought, excuse me, what? But yeah, I had to have 160 practicum hours. And here was the issue, okay? No one said you can't do your practicum in the summer if you're going to be a school librarian. No one said that until April to me. And I thought, no, I am graduating in August of 2019 and you're not stopping me. And so basically, I know I'm such a brat, but basically I told them, I said, I will find a library that's open in the summer and is willing to allow me to do my practicum if you will approve it. And they said, okay, we will. And so I did. And that friend that I talked about, who's a librarian in Houston, I said, I need your help, please. And so she got on her listservs. She got on some Facebook pages and our groups and said, friends, do any of you have the opportunity? And we found it. And it was wonderful. But yeah, that aspect was, it was scary because I thought, no, I'm graduating and I'm getting a librarian job because I didn't want to be in school anymore. But here's the thing. I know I'm currently a school librarian, and I said when I started I didn't want to be in a school, but in the state of Texas, it's very similar to Michigan. To be a school librarian, you have to have been a teacher for 3 years. You have to have that certificate. And in my mind, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to jump through every single hoop to be a school librarian because there are 1,000 hoops to jump through. And then I'll have that opportunity. So if it presents itself, which it obviously did, I can do that, but I'll also be able to work in an academic setting or a special setting, et cetera.
Well, and I think the takeaway that I hear from you is, and a lot of us share a lot of personality traits, which I have, in my opportunity to interview librarians around the country, I have found us to consistently be type A personalities. We are consistently lifelong learners. Yes. And we tend to be incredibly resourceful when it comes to solving not just our own problems, but other people's problems. And we are nothing if not persistent. Because we're very incredibly driven people. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir, but these are life skills which will serve us well. And it's why we're still here. And, I think it really is a testimony to the people who become school librarians. I also love the story about finding you a placement for your practicum, because it really does emphasize the power of the PLN, the power to network. As you wanted to achieve your goals, reaching out to social media, reaching out and networking, because that was going to be how you resolved your quandary.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because when people say, what did you get a degree in? I said research. I mean, that's really, my degree was how to research things. I mean, literally, that's why I'm here with you right now, because I thought, what have I gotten myself into? I have this, half-inch notebook with some useful things, but it's not going to help me run 4 libraries. And so I researched what are helpful resources, what's going to get me to a place where I don't feel like I'm drowning. And, maybe I won't ever truly feel that way because thank you, pandemic, but I feel like I'm not alone. So maybe I'm a lone ranger in the sense of being at school, but in the grand scheme of things, like I saw a Facebook post today that I felt in my soul. And it was on a librarian group I'm on, and it said, does any other librarian ever feel like all their tasks are completely finished? Anyone? I'm like, no, absolutely not. So I know that I have my people.
Oh, I love to hear that. It makes me remember that, when we support one another, I mean, we really are imparting that knowledge and that experience.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you manage people, and I've been very fortunate to work with people in the library, to have an assistant, to have a clerk. And when you say to this, this person, and I've trained a couple, and it's say, you can leave at the end of the day and still have books to shelve. Like, you see that cart over there, and there are all those books. They're like, yeah, but I just need to finish shelving the books. I'm like, no, you really don't.
Yeah.
It's kind of like laundry. It's just going to keep on piling up. And truly, at the end of the day, it's not going to all be done. You don't leave every day going, I'm done. I finished. No, you're never finished. And
never.
But it's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing, because there's tomorrow. And then we'll come back tomorrow, and if the books get shelved, well, that's great. But you may find yourself putting out fires and solving people's problems all day long. And if the books don't get shelved, that's okay.
Yeah. And also, no one prepared me for how many projects I would have that involved cutting and coloring as well. Being in an elementary library, totally not prepared for that aspect of it. But I know it's weird, but I love that there is something for me tomorrow. We have fall break next week, and I'll work on Monday for a work day, but I'm like, oh man, I have all day, and I can catalog these books, and I can fix these barcodes, and I got to work on the elementary bulletin board, and I love that.
Yeah, and I've heard this from some people. Every day is different.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky, and I think that, one of the things that is keeping this interesting and not upsetting and overwhelming is that every day is different. And the fact is that we do have to learn as librarians how to prioritize what has to get done versus what will get done. Maybe not today, but it'll get done eventually.
Absolutely.
Lori, you are an absolute joy. I would love to hear, I know listeners would love to add you to their growing PLN of guests who have been on this podcast. Would you tell us how we can find you on social media?
Yes, absolutely. For Twitter, it is at librarian_Lori. I know, I'm a fan of alliteration. What can I say? And actually on Facebook, it's Lori Davis for my personal. But I have a school one called Harmony Libraries, if anyone is interested in that. And basically it's book fairs this week.
Well, and nothing like harnessing social media to promote our library programs. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes.
Lori, I wish you the best as we move forward this fall, and I hope all good things for you.
Thank you, and good luck with hybrid learning.
I am so glad that Lori was able to join us on this program today, and especially to share with us all that she has thought about when it comes to reflecting on our experiences in library school. I know for me, I have to think back quite a ways, so I do definitely appreciate all of her ideas, and I hope in a few weeks to offer something of a counterpoint, perhaps from somebody from an academic setting. So friends, if you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Remember, friends, in the show notes is an editable certificate, which you can submit for hours of listening to this podcast for professional development credit. If you're not sure if you can get credit for listening to podcasts about what you do all day, ask your administration. It certainly can't hurt. You can't beat the price, the customized listening experience, or the convenience. The topic of our next episode will be virtual collaboration and my interview with Sarah Sansbury. I hope you will tune in.